Welcome back to Turner Farm, where I teach lots of tips and tricks for being successful with your sourdough. This week, I had planned on restocking our family's bread, but the seasons are shifting, so my sourdough starter has been sluggish and dormant and really just doesn't get active despite continually feeding it. So instead of showing beautiful things to make with sourdough, I'm going to teach you what to do when you have a sourdough starter that just will not get active. I'm going to show you the 3 main things that I do with my own sourdough starter when I am having the exact same issue, so you can take comfort knowing that this is a very common thing to have happen and there's always a way to fix it.
So one of the things I hear all the time with sourdough starters is, I killed my starter, I can't get it going, and so I tossed it and I'm starting again. And so today I want to talk about that because I was anticipating on making some sourdough bread this week, and I'd taken a little break from making bread, and so I put my sourdough starter into the fridge. And normally that's not a big deal. You just take it out of the fridge, you refresh it, and away you go. However, there are times in the year, and usually it happens in between the seasons. So we've been going from like hot and humid, we're getting some drier, cooler temperatures, and your sourdough starter is inevitably going to go through a transition during those times. And I'm here to tell you that sluggish starters are not dead, and it's actually almost impossible to kill your starter. And I know that I've said that before, but it is almost impossible to kill your starter. I've had hundreds of people over the years come to me and say they've killed their starter. I can probably count on one hand the amount of people that actually did kill their sourdough starter. So I'm going to show you what mine looks like. I've been feeding it for the last 3 or 4 days and nothing is happening. Not a single bit of activity is going on inside my jar, not even a bubble. It just looks like it's, dead, doing nothing at all, just totally flat. And I'm not panicking because this has happened to me so many times. So almost every single time the seasons shift, your starter is going to go through a bit of a transition period. It has to relearn kind of how to activate inside of a new climate. And so same thing happens if you move to a new home or a different place and you bring it with you and it has a little bit of a moment trying to get back to life. It's alive, and so it adapts to the climate and the environment that it lives in. So if it's living in a hot, humid environment, it's going to ferment accordingly. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we go from hot and humid to dry and cold, and we don't turn our heat on quite yet because it's not quite that cold yet. However, the nights are getting quite chilly, and so my kitchen is getting quite chilly, and now all of a sudden my sourdough starter is like, what is happening? It doesn't know how to adapt to that environment, and so it just needs a minute. So I'm going to show you 3 main things to do if you have a sluggish sourdough starter, if your starter's gone dormant or is taking a nap and it's not coming back to life. And I'm going to show you my 3 main tricks that I use for my starter during situations like this. So I haven't been paying much attention to it. I've just been kind of feeding it every day. But now I'm noticing, okay, it's really not coming back to life. So we're going to have to start doing a little bit more work with it to kind of get that yeast activated and kind of get things rolling again. First and foremost, let's take a look at this starter. So I fed this 24 hours ago and there is not a whole lot happening inside that jar other than it is getting a little bit stretchier. And it's starting to kind of show. So this is the 4th day, right? So like I've been feeding this for 4 days and nothing is happening. This is the most activity I've seen in 4 days. So, and this wasn't a dehydrated starter or anything like that. It was just a regular starter I had in the fridge that I brought out. This is very normal. So number 1 thing that you're going to do is you're going to come into this and we want to activate the yeast. We want to kickstart. We want to give a little boost to the yeast inside of your sourdough starter. So you're going to come in here, and even though it's it's been fermenting for like 24 hours, or even if it's been 12 hours or whatever it is, you're going to come in and you're going to just give it a really vigorous stir. And see how it's kind of starting to like just bubble a little bit? It's just kind of showing a little bit of life in there. Still no bubbles, obviously, but basically this works the exact same as it would if you're kneading your bread or if you're coil folding your sourdough. When we go in and we manipulate your starter, it starts to activate that gluten, it starts to activate that yeast. So we want to get in there and we want to kind of stir it up. So even if you're not going to feed it, you can come in here and you can start activating the yeast. And if it hasn't risen, we don't want to bust any gas bubbles. So if it is starting to rise and look active, you don't want to obviously do this. But if it's not showing any signs of activity, then we can kind of give it a little bit of help. You know, we're going to feed this right now, but you can do it right before you feed it, or you can do it kind of even halfway through your ferment while it's sitting on your counter. So that's the number one thing that you can kind of come in and do, is reactivate that yeast, kind of get things moving inside that jar. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to feed our sourdough starter extra thick. So we want to feed once a day. We want to keep on feeding our sourdough starter. So I'm going to take my clean jar. I'm going to pour my water in first, and then my flour. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to actually put a little bit of extra flour, so more flour than water, into this jar. And then we're going to actually feed the ratio of this. So typically I like to do 5 parts food to 1 part sourdough. I'm going to double that. So I'm going to do a little bit of extra sourdough just because this needs a little bit of help getting going. We're going to come in here and we're going to go back to the first tip. So as you're stirring this up, we want to gauge. So I actually think that I want a little more flour than that. I want this to be nice and thick. Okay, so then we're going to go back to that first tip and we're going to activate that yeast again. So you want to stir this really, really vigorous. So see how it's already starting to get stretchy? You want that consistency. Okay, you want this to be really nice and thick, so when you lift this up, you tip it over and it doesn't fall back into your jar. That's how thick you want your starter to be. So I'll explain that as to why we want a thick starter. Okay, so those are the first 2 things. We're activating the yeast. You can do that in the old starter right before you feed it. So you can even see there's a little tiny bit of bubbles happening on the top of that. And then when we feed it, we're going to do it again. So we're activating the yeast inside the new jar before we put the cover back on. Okay, so why do we want to feed our sourdough starters thick? So this trick is actually really helpful for any season. So if you're going from hot to cold, you want to feed your starter thicker, because the more food it has, the more yeast it's going to have to activate, especially if we're doing that first trick by stirring it all up. So more food equals more yeast. And that sort of like automatically grows that kind of heat inside of the jar to start digesting and breaking down and developing that gluten. And what's that going to do is that's going to activate your sourdough starter. So more food equals more yeast. And you like that when the temperatures are starting to get a little bit cool, because it's sort of like when we digest food in our stomach, it makes us warm, right? So we give the starter more food, it kind of starts to get things moving in there and get things activating. So I like to use that in any season, especially if you're going from cold to hot. When we come out of cold and hot, when it starts to get really warm out and our starters start to maybe ferment a little bit faster, we end up with soupier, non-active sourdough starters, and it's hard to kind of catch them at their peak. So same thing, you can just feed them a little bit more food. When you feed them more food, it takes longer in the warmer months for it to eat through the food. When it takes longer to eat through the food, then that means you have a healthier and more active sourdough starter for longer. So it works in both ways. It's a really great tip because you can use it across the board. You know, if your starter's sluggish, it doesn't matter if it's hot or cold out, just feed it a little bit more food, feed it a little bit thicker, and I'm a huge proponent for using that tip in any season. And especially when you're taking it out of the fridge, feeding it more food when you do your first feed out of the fridge starts to really activate and kickstart that yeast. Okay, so we got our first one is activating the yeast by stirring vigorously before we feed it and even after, right after we feed it, and giving it more yeast by giving a little bit of extra flour into that jar. So the third thing, and I can't stress this one enough because I think what happens is when people end up with sluggish sourdough starters, they start to think that they need to feed their starter more often. So they may look at that and think, okay, it's been 12 hours, nothing's happening, I should feed it again. The problem with that is if you don't have an active sourdough starter that you're feeding into the new jar, you're slowly just smothering out the starter because it hasn't had time to actually fully activate. So you're actually putting a non-active starter into non-active active flour and water to try to activate it, and what you're doing is just slowly just smothering and drowning out those cultures that you need it to get active. So instead, what I find in these situations, and especially in the colder months, because it takes so much longer for things to ferment in the colder months, is that it actually needs more time, not less time. So when you're looking at your sourdough starter and it looks like it needs to be fed and you want to feed it twice in a day because you really need it to get going and you really need it to activate, unfortunately, you're doing more harm than good. What it probably needs is like extra time. So like mine is 24 hours. I've let mine go, even beyond the 24-hour mark, just to kind of get a little bit of activity in there. And the longer you let it sit, then especially when it's cold out, the more fermentation that can start to happen. I'm not saying it's going to get active by the end of that, but I'm saying if you let it go a little bit longer, especially if you're doing the first tip by stirring it at the 12-hour mark and maybe even stirring it again, and you're activating that yeast a little bit, then by the time you go to feed it again, there's enough activity in there, and I'm seeing that today, that probably by tomorrow with this feed, I'm going to see a lot more bubbles and things going on inside my sourdough starter. So I think it's a matter of patience, and that's really hard when you have a sluggish sourdough starter. You just have to keep feeding it. Keep feeding it every day, but not more than once a day, and even allowing it to go a little bit longer than a full day, so it gets that extra time to develop the yeast and develop the gluten as it sort of acclimates to the new temperatures and new climate that it's trying to deal with, especially for us here as it's gotten so chilly. It's starting to acclimate to that new climate, and it needs to learn how to ferment in a timely manner within that climate. Okay, so those are the three things. So it's all about activating the yeast and giving your starter enough time to come back to life. I promise you, a sluggish starter does not equal a dead starter. It doesn't matter what you've done to your starter, even if you've left it for a really long time and it develops a layer of liquid, which is called hooch. It's just alcohol separating from your grain. You can stir it in or dump it off and feed it as normal. It is not dead. It is almost impossible to kill a healthy, active sourdough starter if it was at one point active, which mine was. So mine's not dead, yours isn't dead. These are just 3 tips to use if you have a sluggish, dormant sourdough starter to kickstart that yeast to kind of bring it back to life. So just as I predicted yesterday, I'm finally getting some activity in my starter today. And this was a full day of letting it sit on the counter, just where my kitchen is a bit colder. I'm finally able, this is active enough that I can make a leaven for bread from this. So this was 5 full days of feeding my sourdough starter to bring it back to life out of the fridge because of our seasons changing. So keep going, it will come back. It always comes back to life. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'm happy to answer them in the comments below, and make sure that you subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.